Once again we head to lovely Cornwall and its haunting moorlands, crashing seas and pretty villages. As we have already found out, it is a place still full of Celtic mystery, of ghosts and witches and pixies and fairy folk, and a wealth of folklore to discover and immerse ourselves in. One thing I find interesting, and Marc also, is how the people of the Dumnonii spread across all from Cornwall and Devon. The same peoples, the same tribes. No wonder the folklore is so similar between these two counties. And these people also inhabited Brittany in northern France. And there again the folklore is so similar. Arthurian legends, which I will do some stories from relevant to Cornwall as part of the series, are as strong in Brittany as in Cornwall. If you ever manage to travel to Brittany, I suggest visiting our friends at the Château de Compère, the centre of Arthurian imagination, in the forests of Broceliande. All of that area is chock full of delight, art and folklore, and Arthurian legend, and it's a perfect place to roam around and discover the commonalities between here and Cornwall. So what of today's episode? Well, going back to our long piece of land that juts into the sea, let us wander down the lanes a while and follow some of the little old road signs, because there are stories down these sunken lanes and adventures to find. Padstow is one of the prettiest little harbourside villages we can visit in Cornwall. Nowadays, the famous TV chef Rick Stein has many businesses there and lives there. I remember when he opened his first restaurant there and the stir it caused. I have many very fond childhood memories of Padstow. Truly it's a magical place, with a classic enclosed Cornish harbour and colourful fishing boats, and every May hundreds of people gather in the village to celebrate the Obios festival. Heaven knows how far it stretches back, but there is a great honour in being chosen to play the part of the Os and the costumed retinue. Honestly, it's one of those fascinating British folklore customs that one cannot help being swept away by, and we can totally recommend a visit to Padstow. My tale today, though, is not about the Os, but it is about little men and little horses. There was once a rather grand house on the market square that had a rather peculiar decoration on the roof, and this was 2 little men on 2 little horses. For hundreds of years these small fellows were atop the roof, never moving at all, except when the church bell struck midnight. As the last vibration of the last note would sound, the 2 horsemen would leap down the roof and the small riders gallop around the marketplace and up and down the many winding streets and alleyways of Padstow town. The house on which they rested during the rest of the time changed much over the hundreds of years that passed by, but always they stood still and safe. Of course, children are curious about many strange things, and the 2 little horsemen were no different. What were they? The good children would ask, and those who knew would tell them the story of the magical gallops at midnight. Of course, as all good children are in bed well before the clock strikes 12, they had never and would never see this wondrous sight. That is all except for one child, a little boy called Robin Buddock, who had learned the legend from his grandmother, and his own home was just across from the house where the horsemen stood. Some tales say he was the son of a sailmaker, some a toy maker, but whichever the tale, all agree he was the most curious boy, and had determined that he would see for himself the little horseman at the gallops. His parents had been invited to a party, so this would be his chance. He would be able to plan everything and no one would be any the wiser, but he would know the truth of it all. Robin slept well from his usual bedtime, and just before 12 he woke, ready for a grand adventure. The house was completely silent and completely dark. He was definitely alone. Quickly he crept from his bed and to the door, which led to an outside stone stairway that led to the ground level of the market square. From the top of these stairs he could clearly see the little horsemen in the moonlight in their usual place on the big house opposite. As the last note sounded of the church bell, much to Robin's delight and amazement, the 2 horses pranced, and the 2 little men rode their steeds down the roof of the house and took a great leap to the ground. From here they began to gallop around and around the square. Robin was delighted now at their funny little prancing and dancing around. They looked just like the wooden horses his father made. As he watched their fun, he clapped his hands and cheered them on, and the horsemen took absolutely no notice of the little spectator. As they got nearer to his outdoor stairway, they shot together up one of the lanes. Robin was beside himself with excitement. He flew down the steps, his feet bare skin and in his white flimsy nightshirt, but he was determined to follow wherever the little horsemen would gallop. The boy ran for all he was worth, and yet no matter their small size, he simply could not catch up to these horsemen. Always they were just out of reach. As he reached the middle of Middle Street, they were at the top. Here he saw them pull the horse's bridle to a halt. They took a breath outside a pillared grand house, and then turned and shot up, off Workhouse Hill. Robin picked up speed now, his snow-white nightshirt flying behind him, his bare feet padding on cobbled stone. Now, halfway up Church Street, there they were, but galloping towards him. They had finished the gallops and were returning. He stepped to one side and waited for the pair to pass him by, and as they did so, he could see huge grins on their funny little faces. He did his best to run alongside them now, feet still padding, shirt still flying, but they once again gave even more speed and left him far behind. Only the sound of tiny hooves on stone were left for him to follow. And he did, as fast as his now tired legs could carry him, right back to the market square. But where were they? He looked up to the ground house, and there they were, stood as stock still as usual on top of the roof, as though they had never moved at all. He couldn't believe it. He stood watching them for a very long while to see if they moved, until he began to feel the cold stone under his feet and the cold creep up his toes and into his little feet. He walked quickly back to his own house and fell asleep before he could even help himself. And this is where his parents found him. Not so very long afterwards, his toes tucked underneath him and sleeping sound upon the step. His parents gently roused him, and he told them that it was true. The clock did strike 12. The little men galloped all around the market and the town, and he followed them everywhere. He was so pleased that he had seen them, just as Grandma had told him it would happen. His father laughed at this, surely a small child's dream. He was glad his son had seen them too, he said. Surely Robin was the very first child to see them with his own eyes, and would probably be the very last. So what happened to these little horsemen? Are they still there, or swept away with time and so-called progress? Well, despite the disappearance of the little riders some years ago when renovations were taking place, and then an investigation took place, these 2 fine fellows are back on the roof of one of the local fudge shops, or at the museum. I haven't been able to get over to Padstow to look for ourselves. So if any of you lovely listeners know, maybe you could let me know in the comments so that we can go and see the little horsemen for ourselves the next time we are in Padstow. Once, long ago, at a little village called Gwynner, lived a young fellow called Thomas. In the same village lived more of the Thomas family, and over the years he had begun to court his cousin Elizabeth. Thomas had promised to marry Elizabeth many times, but so far an actual date had not been set, and it would seem that Elizabeth's devotion to Thomas was quite a little stronger than that of Thomas to Elizabeth. After a small disagreement, Rather than forgiving and forgetting, Thomas walked away from his heartbroken beloved and proposed to another young lady of Gwynedd. It was a Sunday afternoon when Thomas, despite poor Elizabeth, took a stroll by her family cottage with his new love. Elizabeth saw it all. And she was a passionate woman, passionate and still in love with Thomas. The grief was too much for her to bear. She took her prayer book and a rope and headed to the path where her former lover and his new love would no doubt return. And here the worst that you can imagine happened. The worst that you can possibly imagine. Elizabeth was no more. Her former beau, well, he never saw the poor girl because he walked his future wife back to the village by a different route. Once at Gwynedd, the villagers asked had he seen Elizabeth, did he have any idea where she could be, because the whole family was searching for the girl. Thomas was shocked and worried now that she may have taken herself to her maker as she'd always threatened should he leave her. In panic he joined the search, and it was he who headed towards the tree. And poor Elizabeth. Her prayer book was open below her feet. Thomas picked up the book and looked at the page that had been left open, the page of the cursing psalm, and there he found she had scribed her name and a note left for him. When you see, remember me. Now his heart fell, not for what he had done to Elizabeth, but in pity for his own selfish self. I am ruined, ruined for ever and ever, he bewailed. Always he would be looked at as the cause of an innocent young woman's plight, and rightly so. And from that moment Thomas left Gwynedd, travelling far and wide, working as a hired labourer, and as far as anyone knew who lived in the area, he had gone for good. Nothing was seen of him for many, many years, until he turned up living in the village of Market. Never once did Thomas set foot in church here on a Sunday for fear of hearing Psalm 109 spoken in the pulpit, a psalm known for calling down the revenge of God upon the deceitful one who has harmed an innocent. Working in the mines, Thomas was harmed many, many times, and this was something that he blamed on the curse of Elizabeth, who appeared as a ghost to haunt him, and always filled him with terror. Always she carried the open prayer book, always the curse present in and around him wherever he went. Over time he became completely paranoid, never sleeping in any room alone, not even for a nap. And when he did sleep, he would awake with a start, screaming, "Oh dear Betsy, shut the book, do shut the book." Now, despite this mental turmoil, he was physically fit and physically healthy, and was admired by his fellows and friends. They suggested that he marry, find a good woman to help him ease his mind and look after him. Nothing better to get rid of a dead near wife than a nice new one. Thomas took heed of all of this and began to tentatively court a few young ladies around the area. But his notoriety had spread far and wide. To all the families he was known for his maltreatment and spite towards Elizabeth, and no way would any family allow one of their beloved daughters to associate with such a rogue. And the young ladies too, they themselves would mock Thomas and his curse. At last one widow in Market village felt sorry for him and agreed to become his wife. And his colleagues were correct, Elizabeth's ghost did leave him alone for a while. The day of the wedding came and the couple made their way to St. Hilary Church. It was a beautifully sunny Cornish day, but as they walked the road and neared the church, the weather changed. The skies became black. Lightning blasted the skies and thunder rolled above them. This was the time of harvest in the year, and folks were gathering barley to the left and to the right of the road, frantically as the rain poured down so that the barley didn't spoil. And then there before him on the path stood Elizabeth, the betrayed maiden, now a ghost, her prayer book in her hands. He made to pull back and cried that she was there. But the widow urged him forwards. There was nobody there that she could see. She forced him along the path, and into the church, and here they married at last. For a few years all was well with Thomas and his wife. 2 children soon joined them, and they became a little family. But once more the nightmares returned, the dreaded visions of Elizabeth, the visits of the ghosts of Elizabeth. And misfortune followed every dream, every visitation and every vision. Thomas was plagued and worn out, a mere shell of himself physically, and tortured mentally. At only 40 years of age he passed away, and his body laid to rest in St. Hilary churchyard, the end of a man whose youthful arrogance and cruelty punished him for all of his life. Once upon the moorland of Cornwall there lived an old man and his old wife. These were called Grandfer Nan Kivell and Granny Nan Kivell, and with them lived their little granddaughter Gennifer. This young child was as brown as a nut, and very small for her age, pretty as a picture, with lips as red as berries, sparkling eyes and the loveliest ruddy cheeks. As Grandfer would say, she was as brown as a Piskey. Grandfer was a turf cutter, cutting the turfs to place on the fire to heat the poor cottages of all the area. All of his days were spent out in all weathers, cutting the turfs upon the moor. It was when Grandfer was around 60 or 70 years old that he made a huge mistake. You see, while he was out cutting away at the earth, he accidentally cleared out a whole Piskey bed. Now, as we know from our Dartmoor pixie tales, they never like to be disturbed, and many terrible things can come from such an act, even if purely by accident. These moorland Piskies did some hunting around and discovered it was Grandfer who had ripped up their turfs, and they planned a revenge. Now, every time Grandfer would make his way home after a long day's digging, their Piskey lights would try and lead him off the path and into danger. But Grandfer was a countryman, and he had been taught the ways of Cornish Piskies as a young boy. Whenever he would travel the moors, he would always wear a piece of clothing inside out to trick the Piskies, and this way they would have no power over him. It confused them. It was a strange human thing to do. They would obsess about this strange thing that the human had done, and forget completely what they were supposed to be doing. But, just as Grandfer Nan Kivell had learned about pixies, so had the pixies learned about Grandfer, and so gathering together, they met to work out a way to do harm to Grandfer Nan Kivell. During one of their meets, they learned that Grandfer Nan Kivell had a very sweet tooth, and his favourite treats were the sugar biscuits made by his own wife, and a junket made from best Cornish cream, spices and sugar. And they also learned that once Granny Nan Kivell made these sweet treats, she would leave them safely secured in the pantry. The Piskies decided the punishment. They would steal the lovely biscuits and the milk pudding the next time Granny had made fresh. And they tasked other fairy folk of the moor to keep a watch by the pantry window to see when Granny Nan Kivell would store the foods. As soon as this happened, the fairies must tell the pixies so they could proceed with the next part of the plan. For many weeks the fairies watched patiently for Granny to carry out her baking, and they had almost given up at one point until one fine day through the window they saw Granny open the pantry door and place the treats in the room, and they watched as she placed the junket on an old oak table in the little room and the biscuits on the stone bench. The moment her back was turned, the fairies sped away from the cottage to the moorland, and as they reached their fairykin they panted, "A big round basin full of lovely cool junket, and a dish heaping full of round biscuits, yellow and white with eggs and sugar, with which they are all made. I heard the old woman say she'd never made better, and all for Grandfer Nan Kivell, because it's his birthday tomorrow." The Piskies vowed Grandfer would not taste one single biscuit, or taste one spoon of junket pudding. They would have the lot. But the fairies of the moor would also have their share of the spoils for their diligent work. Now, the Piskies and the Fairies made their way silently and speedily to Nankivel Cottage. Once there, they crept inside and into the pantry, and here the Piskies scooped up all the junket with their little hands and ate the lot. The sugar biscuits they passed to the Fairies who were waiting outside. Next day, Granny went happily to her pantry to reveal Grandfa's feast, and was horrified to see not a drop of the junket left, and only a few scattered crumbs of the biscuits. And Granny looked suspiciously at Jennifer, her granddaughter. Only she had seen Granny place the biscuits and the junket in the pantry. Granny told her husband about the missing treats. Maybe the cat lapped up the milk pudding, he suggested. She could make sure the window was locked, and better locked next time. Granny protested she had, and also what of the biscuits? The cat would not touch the biscuits, and only crumbs were left. 2 pairs of eyes now looked in Jennifer's direction. But over time all was forgotten, and life, well, it carried on. It was not too long before Granny decided she would make some nice gifts for Grandpa once more, and this time she made a conscious effort to notice she definitely locked the window. However, the morning after, everything was gone once more. Granny ran to tell Grandpa of the misfortune. "'Tis a 2-legged cat who has eaten up my beautiful biscuits and junket." She cast a look in the direction of their granddaughter. Jennifer noticed this, and she was mortified. How could they possibly think that she was a thief? She would never do that to her grandfather or her grandmother. She protested her innocence to them both, and Granny challenged back that only she had seen the new batch of biscuits and a new bowl of junket being placed in the pantry. Grandpa calmed her down and told her next time, just lock the window and also lock the pantry door. Granny sighed, and Granny agreed. Once more, a few days later, Granny found time to make Grandpa's favourite treats, and this time she made damn sure she locked tight the window, and she placed a heavy bar over the door. Next morning she opened the pantry door, and as she expected, everything was gone. Granny wailed at Grandpa. It was definitely Jennifer. Cats and dogs could not open windows and could not lift bars on doors. It must be the child. Her husband waved his hand, and he would not hear of it. She challenged him back. Who else if not her? But still Grandpa refused to agree. It was not his granddaughter. But then who? Grandpa thought for a while, and a light came into his eyes, and he spoke to Granny. "It's Piskies. It must be the Piskies." His great-grandmother had warned him of them when he was a child, and she always made a little extra cream and bread for them whenever she cooked and baked, as she knew they were rather greedy little folk. Granny scoffed. Absolute nonsense. Piskies, whatever next? And so once more the old lady made a junket for Grandpa and a lovely heaped plate of fresh biscuits, and she locked them all safely away in the pantry and went to bed. In the night, when all were asleep, or should have been, Granny crept quietly down the stairs to see if she could catch her granddaughter stealing her food. And who did she see by the pantry door? Jennifer. Jennifer held a finger to her lips, though. Quiet as possible, she whispered in Granny's ear. And she told her that she thought the Piskies must be the thieves, because she thought she saw one climb through the keyhole. She urged Granny to look through and see if they were in there. Granny leaned down and peeped inside the pantry door, and could not believe her eyes. Inside the room were so many tiny men, green coats and fine whiskers, all standing around the junket bowl and reaching into the pudding, bringing out tiny cupped handfuls of the sweet creamy custard. More of these little fellows were in a line, passing sugar biscuits one to the other in a row, and passing them through the open window to someone who was unseen below, and they were having a fine old laugh and a fine old time at the expense of the Nankivels. Granny was speechless for a mere moment, and then her temper rose like heat. "Filling your little bellies with the junket and the biscuits I made for my old man, be?" she cried. "I'll wring the necks of every one of you." No sooner had she shouted than every single Piskey disappeared. She looked everywhere, but could not find a single one. Grandfer now joined his wife and grandchild and listened to everything they told him. He told them that the Piskies, they will still be in the pantry. They had used their magic to become invisible. And now he spoke aloud that hopefully the Piskies and he were even. They had all had biscuits and junkets. He had taken their turf beds by accident, and he hoped they could put it all behind them. And with that, the Piskies never more were a nuisance to Granny or Grandfer Nankivel. Not a single biscuit or a spoon of junket was ever stolen again. And Gennifer, well, from that day nobody ever doubted Gennifer's honesty. My tales of old Cornish folklore would not be complete without a story that included a mermaid. The seas that swell and break around the Cornish coast are filled with merfolk, or so the tales will tell us. Let's have the story, the very famous one, of old Luty and the Mermaid. Once long ago, on a beautiful summer evening, Luty stood on the shoreline, nearby the part of Cornwall called the Lizard. His little farm was above him, close to the cliff edge, a humble home, but home. Luty was a man who made his money where he could, sometimes fishing, sometimes farming, and sometimes smuggling when good money was a prospect. He was walking along the beach looking for anything that had washed up, any wreckage that he could scrounge from, but sadly Luty had no luck. There had been meagre pickings for a long, long while now, and he was turning back to make his way home when he heard a sad long cry and a wailing. It sounded like a child or a woman needing help. Luty stopped dead in his tracks, peering into the distance towards the strange sound, but he could see nothing unusual. Once more the sound of the cry again. Luty decided he must go and see what was happening. This could be some poor unfortunate person crying for help. He began to retrace his steps over the sands. In the distance, he could now see the familiar rocks that were often covered by the tide at high water, although now the black rocks stuck proud from the yellow sands. It was the time of springtide, and a lot of rock was exposed that usually would not be seen during a normal tide. And then the cry again. Luty picked up speed. Someone definitely was in distress. At the rocks he looked everywhere and there was nothing. He rushed around to the other side where the sea would hit first as the tide came in, and it was there that he saw a sight that left him open-mouthed and speechless. On one of the rock ledges that was almost covered in stinking seaweed that scattered over the rocks was a woman. And this woman was so beautiful, the most beautiful creature Luty had ever seen in his life. Her hair was long and gloriously shining like spun gold. Her skin was white as porcelain, touched with the blush of rose petals. It reminded him of the pretty pink cowrie shells he sometimes picked up on his wanders on shore. Her eyes were a perfect green, sparkling and flashing like the sun on emerald waves. Everything about her reminded him of the sea and the shore, as though this strange woman was it personified. She looked out to sea with the most painful and desolate look in her eyes. So desolate. Luty had never seen anything like this, and now and then a cry rose from her that pulled at his heartstrings. She hadn't heard him approach, so loud was the crashing of the waves on the rocks. And as the waves rolled over the sands, Luty coughed. She took no notice. Luty kicked a rock. She didn't hear. At last Luty stepped closer to her and spoke, and gently asked of her, was she all right? Did she need his help? At this the woman cried aloud, terrified, and she slipped down into a deep rock pool beneath the rocks, and now he could not see her at all. Luty panicked. Had she drowned? He rushed now to the pool and looked into the deep green tinted water. And now he saw her. Among the seaweed drifting out on the water were strands of golden hair. And looking deeper, he could see her face looking up at him, and soft round pink shoulders. His eye was in now, and he could see more of her white skin, and he jumped back. The woman had a tail, a fish's tail. He fell to his knees. Oh, the gods, he had found a stranded mermaid, and both human and mermaid were terrified. Looty crawled on his hands and knees to the edge of the water, and he spoke quietly once more. He told her softly she had nothing to fear from him, for he would never hurt a single living thing. He just wanted to know how could he help her, but would she understand him, magical creature as she was? Now the mermaid had risen in her pool a little, and she spoke back in return, and yet her lips never moved. Instead she spoke only using her mind, and in this way she explained that her kind could understand all human speech as they travelled every part of the oceans and every part of the seas, and they listened to all of those who travelled over their watery realm. She told him how they believed it was sad that humans were bound to wear clothing, everything so tightly bound, and could never understand the true freedom of the merfolk and the fish. Looty smiled. He was a simple man. He had no clue what the heck she was talking about. But he was also a very kind man, and he asked how he could help her once more. And please don't cry, because he would do all he could to help. As he spoke so kindly and softly, the mermaid had risen higher in the water, and now she climbed right out of the water and sat back upon the rock, making herself comfortable. Her hair covered her, and leaving Looty with no embarrassment at her pure nakedness. Now she told him her story as she combed her beautiful hair. She had been playing with her husband and children in the sea, and they had become so tired, and they rested at Kynan's Cove, her husband sleeping upon a bed of seaweed, her children still playing in the water, and she was alone, drifting in thought and watching everything gently. She had become aware of a strange scent to her and realised it was coming from a garden, a human garden. She made her way to where this wonderful scent was coming from, and she was entranced. It was so beautiful. She had never smelled anything so wonderful in her life. Nothing in the sea had such intense perfume as these flowers. She had swum as close as possible, but she could not see the flowers, and so she had rested on the rock here, and she had closed her eyes and just breathed in the scent, and she had slipped into a reverie and slipped into a dream, and when she came to, she was horrified to see the waves were so far away, and the rock she was sat upon was now so far from the sea, and she was stranded. She explained that her husband was a merman, and it was her nature to be fed as soon as he was hungry. If he could not find food, or she was not there to feed him, he might eat the children. Looty sprang to his feet. Surely not, that was horrific. He began to cry. It was true. It was the way of all mermen. Looty calmed her down. Not to worry, the tide will come back in and she will be free soon. But by now she was inconsolable. The poor creature begged Looty to carry her to the waves. She would give him riches beyond anything that he could imagine. She would give him anything, literally anything he asked for. It would be his. The mermaid was so beautiful, so magical, a creature that Looty could not behold without wonder, and he could not help himself. Her voice was like a melody. He would do anything. He would do anything to help her. He was her slave from that moment. Looty bent down to lift the mermaid from the rocks. She told him he must first place her pearl comb safely in his clothes, and this would be proof to him that this was not a dream. When he needed her help, he must bring her comb to the waves and comb the sea 3 times and call her name, Morwenna. She would come to help him. This was her promise. Now he could carry her to the water. As he carried her, she whispered in his ear and asked him to tell her his 3 wishes. although riches would be his regardless because of his sweet kindness. Lootie thought for a moment as he walked. Riches, he said, meant nothing to him, but he should like to have the ability to remove the spells of witches. He would like to be able to speak with the spirits so he could learn their secrets, and finally, he would like to be a healer and able to cure illnesses. At this the mermaid was surprised. Surely he was the most unselfish man she had ever seen, and he would have his 3 wishes, and all his family would never want for anything ever. As Lootie carried her over the vast expanse of golden sand, she told him all about her land under the seas, about her travels and the ways of her people. She asked him to come with her. She could make him happy. She could make the magic happen. She would show him all the riches of merfolk, the sunken palaces and the realms. He would meet and befriend the merfolk, and they would care for him. He would know happiness beyond all measure. Lootie told her he would rather stay on land, crude as it was by comparison. He loved his picking along the seashore from the ships and his wife. She offered again to have him come with her, but he was afraid he would drown. But of course not, she said. She would never let that happen. Her magic would become his. He would breathe as she did. By now they were in the waves, and the foam was rolling all around his legs and the spray hitting his arms. She would simply make 2 slits where gills would be. He would be able to live as she and her kind did. Oh, Lootie was so tempted. But no, she raised her arms around his neck and placed a cold kiss on his cheek. Gods, no. He was just about to surrender and go with her, and the sound of a dog barking along the shore came to his ears. It was Lootie's faithful dog, desperately trying to rouse him from this strange reverie, calling for his master to come back. Master, come back. He looked back at his beloved dog, his faithful pet, and up to his home where his family were. The sun fiercely bright upon the windows now. His wife would be taking supper from the oven around about now, and smoke was curling from the chimney. The garden was so full of flowers. A wave hit him. He jumped. The coldness. For heaven's sake, it was up to his chest now. He dropped her into the surf and he shrieked, but her tail curled around his legs and her long fingers clung to him fiercely. He remembered the tales of the dangers of the mermaids. He grasped for a knife he kept in his pocket, and it flashed before her face, and she released him. And now she drifted backwards deeper into the waves, singing as she swam with a plaintive air. Farewell, farewell for 9 long years. Then, my love, I will come again. Mine, mine, forever mine. Lootie turned and waded to the sands as fast as possible, waves trying to bring him to his knees as he strode. On shore he fell to his knees, confused and afraid and shocked, hot tears rolling down his cold cheeks. Now he crawled to the hiding place where he kept smuggled goods, and in a place familiar to him he fell to the floor and fell into a deep sleep. Lootie was exhausted. Back at Lootie's cottage, his wife Anne Betty was becoming desperate. Supper had come and her husband was still not home. She spent a lonely, cold and tear-filled night watching the window with her lamp, opening the door regularly to peer out into the darkness, looking for her Lootie. By breakfast she could bear it no longer. She wrapped herself up and ran out to search for him. Dead or alive, she needed to find her husband. It didn't take long for Anne Betty to find him. At their shed, their dog was curled up at the door, sleeping. She knew wherever the dog was, Lootie would not be far off. She roused the little dog and opened the door, and Lootie was found. He was still out cold asleep, and now her panic turned to anger. She shook him awake. Why was he asleep in the shed? Why didn't he come home? She was scared to death. Half asleep, he opened his tired eyes. Was she the beautiful mermaid? Was that Morwenna come for him finally? She scoffed, confused. What the hell was he talking about? He hadn't called her beautiful for an age. Who was Morwenna? Now he understood more and came to more with his senses. Grasping her hands, He told her she had almost become a widow that night, and thank God she was with him, and he was alive. And now Aunt Betty was worried. She took him back to the cottage. She would keep a watchful eye and call for the doctor if his mind did not become more normal. She gave him hot food and hot drink, and little by little Lootie came to his senses properly. And now he told his wife the whole story. And the way he told her his tale, she completely believed him, as incredible as it was. She believed every single word. Once he was resting, Aunt Betty went to every single friend in the village and told them Lootie's tale, and as proof showed them the pearl comb that the mermaid had left with her husband. Word spread. It always does, doesn't it? People came from miles around for healing. They brought family members and children for healing, and once it was known he could break the spells of witches, well, he was inundated with people both day and night. His fame spread, and the simple man's life was changed forever. He had no peace day or night. His wishes had all been granted, and his family did well from the mermaid's blessing, even if he had left her on such negative terms. After all, he'd dropped her in the sea and threatened her with a knife. But what else could he have done? At the back of his mind was always the words that Morwenna had sung as she swam away from him. 9 years, 9 years. And yet over time this too faded to a distant memory. And indeed, 9 years from that fateful day on a night when the sea is just so gentle, like a mill pond, and the moon is full and all bathed in silver light, Lootie and his friend decided to do a little night fishing. The sea all around them in the boat was so still, like glass, like a mirror of stars, and yet there upon the water became a bubbling sound, and then more bubbles, and then a rush of more, until an eruption of bubbles and foam rose in the water, and now a single wave, mighty and filled with foam, and there in the middle of the wave was Morwenna. Morwenna. Beautiful Morwenna. White arms reaching for him and green eyes fixed on his. Not a word she spoke. But Lootie rose in the little boat. His eyes never left hers. His friend grabbed his leg. "My time is come," he spoke flatly. And with that he stepped towards Morwenna and into the water, and they swam together for a while away from the boat. And then his friend watched as they slipped beneath the surface. The sea, still as glass, returned, and Lootie was lost to the human world. People searched for Lootie's body for weeks, and it was of course never found. It was presumed by Aunt Betty and all around that he must be living beneath the sea with Morwenna, in the palaces that she had described to him, filled with riches and living, cared for as well as anyone could wish for. At least Aunt Betty hoped so, and his family also, despite their grief. And was that the end of the tale of the family of Lootie? Sadly no, for the blessing of the mermaid came with a sting in its tail, a further curse. For it was so that every 9 years, no matter how far from the sea and the oceans and the rivers, a single descendant of Lootie would lose their life in water. Mermaids are indeed so very tempting, and yet so very dangerous. And so, dear friends, thank you so much for joining me on this journey to our beloved Cornwall. Of course there will be more, and some things happening later this year that will mean some different content that will involve all of the things that we love, and also a fair amount of art, our own art, but more of that in the future. For now, dear friends, welcome or welcome back to Cornwall. Please do join me again on some more Cornish folklore adventures. We will have a fine old time among the Piskies, witches, mermaids and fairies, with caution of course. Always with caution. And so, dear friends, thank you so much for supporting our folkloric adventures so far. Please do subscribe and tell your pals who love folklore and fairies about us, and join us again. So until next time, dear friends, take care, brightest of blessings, and remember, don't play with the fairy folk, or you may end up in one of my folk tales yourself.